All right, how we doing tonight? Good? How many people are excited that the sun was still out when you were pulling in the parking lot? You could see things, right? Spring forward. The hour sacrifice was worth it, right? Hey, if we never met before, my name is Jay. I get the awesome privilege of directing this ministry. I say it every week though, but I don't do it alone. There's a number of people it takes to put this thing on. So I serve with the best leadership team in the world. And could you guys do me a favor? I mean, that was an awesome worship set. Can we thank them? That was cool. If you're new to the community, thank you so much for coming. We're glad you're here. We believe you belong here, so we hope you feel welcome. Every week we take a look into the scriptures to see what it has to say about us, about our lives, but most importantly, what it has to say about God. And so this series is new, and we're going to take the next 4 weeks, and we're going to look at the book of Jonah. And so, how many people grew up familiar, at least a little bit, regardless if you grew up in church, with this story, like the story of Jonah and this big fish? Yeah, a number of us, right? I didn't necessarily have a real consistent church upbringing. My grandparents took me to church sometimes. I didn't really like it that much. I just remember feeling like there's a lot of old people around. I didn't really care much about what was happening. All I really cared about was eating lunch with my grandma and my grandpa. That brought me because I'd get grilled cheese, and she'd cut it into 4 corners, and it was the best grilled cheese ever. And then for dessert, I'd have Teddy Grahams, and I just loved Teddy Grahams. So, but church didn't really resonate much with me. But so when I started coming to church, I didn't really know a lot of these traditional stories that we kind of grow up with. I didn't really know who Moses or Noah was specifically, and I'd mix those names up. But I had some kind of familiarity, and that's kind of the story of Jonah. What's interesting though is it's kind of this childhood story, right, that we hear as kids about this guy and this big fish. But actually, this book has some really deep themes in it, and even gets dark some. And so that's kind of the thought behind the intro video, is that it's cartoonish for kids, but still has kind of these serious, deep, dark tones that we find throughout the book, which is a rather short book. It's 4 chapters, 48 total verses, so it's not very long, yet it's a profound story. Now, skeptics obviously have a hard time with the book. People who don't necessarily believe in miracles have a hard time with the book because, wow, how can a man survive being swallowed up by a big fish? I keep saying big fish because it doesn't specifically say a whale. I know a lot of us assumed it was a whale, but we don't know that. The scriptures don't identify what kind of big fish it is, just like we don't know the piece of fruit that Adam and Eve ate. We assume it was an apple, but we don't know that. It doesn't say an apple. Same with this, so I'm just going to keep calling it the big fish, but skeptics have a problem with it. But what's interesting is, the fish isn't even really the point of the book. 48 verses. You would think that if the theme of the book was all about a fish swallowing up a man, that it would be talked about more than just 3 verses. It's only mentioned 3 times. The last verse in chapter 1, when it says, "But the Lord provided a great fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was inside the fish 3 days and 3 nights," which then gets us thinking about who was dead 3 days and 3 nights and rose again. And Jesus actually calls himself the ultimate Jonah in Matthew 12:41. So there's a breadcrumb right there for us in terms of seeing the foretelling of what King Jesus does for us. But then it just says, then from inside the fish in chapter 2, verse 1, and then in the last verse of chapter 2, verse 10, it says, "And the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto the dry land." It's only 3 verses. It's like the writer, it's not even the point of the story. He's just stating it as a matter of fact. He's not looking to get people to believe in this. So don't get too hung up on the fish and the science behind that. Plus, those of us who worship Jesus believe he conquered sin and death and was resurrected, which in my mind would be a much bigger miracle than being swallowed by a big fish and then surviving that somehow. So That's why someone like me who views the Scriptures in terms of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus and him being the centerpiece of the Scriptures, this idea of a fish and a man isn't really that big of a deal. So, if the point of the book is not about a fish swallowing a man, what is it about? Well, we're going to look at that these next 4 weeks. But let's start with the first couple of verses in the first chapter. It says this: the word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come before me. So let's break that down. The word of the Lord came to Jonah. The readers would know who this is. Jonah, a prophet. Now, a prophet was someone who received special revelation. What I mean by that is they would have a special communion with God, with the divine, and then they would go and be the mouthpiece, the spokesman for what God had to say. So they were anointed. They were chosen. They had a unique role. Some might envy that. You might be tempted to envy a prophet because they get to communicate with God in a special and unique way. But we probably shouldn't, because looking at the prophets in the Old Testament, man, their lives just weren't really that great. So because they would hear from God, and then they would go and pronounce to people what God wanted to tell them, and a lot of times it was like this: hey, listen, you know the way you're acting right now, the way you're living, yeah, God don't really like it that much. And so you should repent, you should change your ways, and let's face it, people don't generally like that, right? Once you start trying to tell people, hey, you really shouldn't do that, what do they usually say? Like, hey, you don't know me, don't tell me about my life, you're not the boss of me, right? And so we shouldn't envy them that much. But Jonah, unique in that he has a special assignment, because it says, go to the city of Nineveh. Now, most prophets were in-house prophets, and what I mean by that is their messages were for the people of Israel. Again, saying, hey, you're God's people. You're supposed to be a light to this world. You're supposed to demonstrate to those who don't know God what God is like. And so all of their messages were in-house. But Jonah had to go somewhere else, to another group of people. And so those who also read this would know that Jonah, the original readers would have remembered him as like intensely patriotic and like a nationalist. And so someone who had a lot of pride in terms of being Jewish and part of the nation of Israel, and someone who didn't care as much about other nations. So Jonah has a special assignment that maybe he's not so crazy about. Interesting. But what we see here in the 4 chapters of Jonah is we see a parallel where we see God trying to tell Jonah to do something, and he says no in chapters 1 and 2, and then we see God saying, all right, let's try this again. And we see these parallels of chapters 1 and 2 to chapters 3 and 4. And I don't want to bore you tonight. I get excited about some of this stuff. I know not everybody does, but I just want to go through it real quick because there's just a lot going on, again, in this book in 4 simple chapters. So we see scene 1 and scene 2. Scene 1 is Jonah pagans in the sea, and scene 2 is Jonah pagans in the city. And we see the parallels right here between the two sets of chapters, chapters 1 and 2 and chapters 3 and 4. So we see in chapter 1:1, God's word comes to Jonah. I just read that. After the fish vomits him out of his mouth, God again says, hey, now go to the city of Nineveh. We see what God's message to be conveyed is in both chapter 1, verse 2 and chapter 3, verse 2. We see the response of Jonah in verse 3 of both chapters 1 and 3. That's what we're going to focus on tonight, was what was his response. So we're going to focus on that tonight. We see the word of warning. We see the response of the pagans. In chapter 1, that's the sailors in the boat that he's on. In chapter 3, that's the Ninevites, the people of Nineveh. And now, if you don't know what the word pagan is, it's simply people who did not have a relationship with the God of the Bible. They were outside of that. They had different beliefs. They didn't worship the same God as the God that represents himself in the scriptures. Then we see the response of the pagan leader. That would be the captain in verse 6 of chapter 1. That would also be the king or the leader of the city of the Ninevites. And then we see their response, both in verse 7 of both chapters 1 and 3. And then we see chapter 2 and chapter 4 are God teaching grace to Jonah through a fish. And then in chapter 4 through a plant. Chapter 4 is really, really an interesting chapter. And we're going to really take an in-depth look on that the last week of this series. So be ready for that. So what was the response of Jonah in chapter 1 and in chapter 3? And did it change? Like, did he get it? Like, did he learn from his first mistake? All right, so let's look at verses 3 and 4. Here's his response in chapter 1. It says this, "But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord." And so Jonah's response to God saying, hey, I want you to go to the city of Nineveh and I want you to preach to them, to tell them to stop their ways because I want to show them mercy. And Jonah's like, I'm not about that. I don't care about those people. And so what does he do? He goes in the exact opposite direction that God is calling him to. He says, you know what? You know how I'm going to avoid this? I'm going to go in the exact opposite direction that God is calling me to do. And so what is he doing? He's running from God. He is running from God. But we see in chapter 3, verse 3, I don't have it on the screen, that Jonah obeyed the word of the Lord and went to Nineveh. So he actually did what God asked him to do. But we see as a result in chapter 4, he just wasn't very happy about it. He did all that God wanted him to do, but he didn't like it. He didn't do it with joy. He didn't believe it was good. He didn't believe it was the best. He didn't believe in God's plan, in God's best. He did not buy into it. And so in a lot of ways, the book of Jonah is a story about running from God and running from all that God has for a person. Which is interesting because there's a parable that Jesus uses. That's one of his more famous, one of his more popular parables, which is just a story that illustrates a spiritual principle. That's what a parable is. And in Luke chapter 15, Jesus tells 3 parables to talk about God's desire for people who run away from him. We see it in the parable of a lost sheep, where someone goes for one lost sheep and leaves 99 to find one. We see it in the parable of a lost coin, looking for a single lost coin. And then we see it in a parable about 2 sons. And I'm going to read that for us tonight. I don't have it on the screen, so you can either follow along with your own copy, whether you got a hard copy or on your phone or something like that. Luke chapter 15, verse 11. And if you're familiar with this story, what I want to encourage you to do is not just go, yeah, I know this story, I know what happens. But again, to think of it through the lens of the book of Jonah. But Jesus tells this story as an illustration of God and people who run away from him. He says this, there was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So he divided his property between the 2 sons. Not long after that, the younger son got together all that he had and set off for a distant country. So we see the motive of the youngest son right away. Hey, God, I know I'm getting an inheritance. Hey, Dad, I know I'm getting an inheritance here. I know you have a lot to give me. Can you give that to me right now? And so this dad goes, okay, sure. And not long after that, peace. He's done. He's running. He's going to a distant country. He doesn't want anything to do with his dad. It almost seems like he's more interested in what he can get from his dad than being with his dad. He's more interested in what he can get out of the relationship he has with his dad than being in relationship with his dad. He set off for a distant country, and there he squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. Now this is rock bottom in a Jewish mind. You remember, the Jewish people did not eat pork. They did not associate with pigs. They considered them unclean. So now we see a rich young kid who is living in a pig pen, who is longing to eat what pigs eat, longing to be unclean like a pig. This is rock bottom for the young son. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired men have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired men.' So he got up and went to his father." He comes to his senses and says, wow, my dad has plenty of wealth. He's a good man. He treats his hired servants well. And I don't even deserve maybe anymore to be called his son. I already spent all of my inheritance. I already got rid of all the advantages of being a son. Maybe I can just be a hired person. Maybe I can just be a worker for him and just be provided for. But while he, the young son, was still a long way off, his father saw him in the distance and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son. So Jesus, again, using this parable as an illustration of how God views those who run away from him, says that the father was looking off in the distance when he saw him. He didn't know his son was coming back per se. It's almost like the dad was always looking every day for his son to come back. And when he saw him, he had compassion for him. So what did he do? The son said to him, he threw his arms around him and kissed him. The son said to him, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." But the father said to his servants, "Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger." It's almost like Beyonce, kind of. "And sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." So they began to celebrate. And so the heart of the Father, Jesus says, is the heart of God for those who run away from him. His open arms. It isn't to beat you down when you come back. It isn't to punish you. It isn't to make you feel really bad about yourself or what you did in terms of running away from God. It's, you're back. Let's celebrate. Let's have the best meal. Let's celebrate that you're here. It's incredible. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. "Your brother has come," he replied, "and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound." The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, "Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders, yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him." "My son," the father said, "you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." Interesting how sour and salty the older brother gets. So much so that he says, "Your son spent all of his money on prostitutes and squandered it on reckless living." Wouldn't even call him his brother anymore. Wouldn't even associate with him like that. Interesting how the older brother did everything the father said, stayed close to the father all that time, yet still, in a sense, was running away from God. Almost so that everything that he was doing with some bad motives. Like, God, I'm going to say yes to you, and now you owe me. God, I'm going to live better than this person. I'm going to live better than my brother. And you know what? Now you owe me, or I can twist your arm and get you to do something for me. Yeah, God, I'm my own morality, my own holiness, my own goodness. I'm a big deal. You owe me. Interesting. And that's the parallel we see in the book of Jonah, where Jonah runs away from God in chapters 1 and 2, saying, I don't want to go anywhere near what God is asking me to do. But then in chapters 3 and 4, goes and does exactly what he's supposed to do. But in essence, we see in the last chapter, and he's far from God. So, the question is, are you running from God? You can run from God in two ways, as we see in this book, the book of Jonah. First one, you can run from God by ignoring his call on your life. That's not just Jonah the prophet. That's you too. We see this. Paul writes about it in Colossians. You were created by Jesus, for Jesus. That God knit you together in the womb. That you were created to do good works in Jesus. That you have a purpose in your life, and so you can run from God by ignoring his call on your life. Isaiah the prophet says this in chapter 53, we all like sheep have gone astray or run away. We have turned everyone to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. You can run from God. And here's the thing. We've all done it. We've all said no to God in some way. Maybe we've been good at some of the commandments. Maybe we've been good at some of the things laid out in the scriptures, but we haven't been good at all of them. There's been times where we've failed and failed miserably. I remember when I was running away from God, particularly when I was a teenager. So like I mentioned in the beginning of the message tonight, I didn't grow up with any kind of consistent church background. My grandparents would take me sometimes, but my parents never went, so I was like, why do I have to go to church? My parents don't even go. But they did send me to a Christian summer camp for a week called Circle C Ranch. And so I was exposed to Jesus and the reality of him and what that looked like for a single week, multiple summers while I was a kid. So it didn't take me long to recognize kind of this call that Jesus has. But then I would spend, probably after a couple of weeks when the camp thing wore off, I would spend the rest of my summer and my entire school years, in essence, running away from God. I was a teenager that had addiction issues, struggled with meaning and purpose, didn't understand why I should even try in school, didn't understand why even follow these social norms. I don't understand. What's the point in all of this? And so I was running from God to the point where I was a junior in high school. Found myself in a desperate situation. In some ways similar to the younger son living in a pig pen. And I thought maybe that God would have to punish me. That I have to pay for all my mistakes. But I soon found out that Jesus already paid for them all. That they were paid for on the cross. And that God was a father with open arms, inviting me to stop running away from him and start running towards him. That was me running away from God as a teenager. There's also another way that we can run from God, and that's this: you can run from God in religious activities, in your own morals and your own standards. Isaiah says this, and Jesus quotes him in Matthew. He says this, "Therefore the Lord said, these people draw near to me with their mouths and honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me." It's like they're running from me. "Their worship of me is but rules taught by men." It's morality or holiness for the sake of me. And so that is the trap you and I can fall into, who maybe attend a Sunday service on a weekly basis, are involved in a small group, come to a community like this on Tuesday nights. All good things. That doesn't mean you're not running from God. You can be surrounded by all this spiritual activity, all these spiritual conversations, teaching of the Word, the sharing of the Scriptures, which are alive and active, and yet still be running away from God. I remember when I did that after my call to ministry. Yeah, I was young, but still, after I had said yes to God by saying, "All right, God, you have my life. You're calling me to full-time ministry?" Like, I think that's a mistake, but okay. It was a summer at that very same camp that I met Jesus at. It was a summer that I was working, and I was considered their program director, which means in a lot of ways, I was the boss of 77 teenagers and college kids. So yeah, it ended up being a rough summer. I think I had to let go like 7 people. There was plenty of people on staff that made my summer miserable. So that was rough. And I just remember this so clearly in August of that summer, saying, "God, you could come to me visually, and I could hear from you audibly to come back and do this again. And I'm telling you my answer right now, no." I was in a bad spot. In a lot of ways, I was Jonah. And I spent that entire school year, senior year of my undergrad at Buff State, in essence, running from God. And I was connected to this ministry. I was looking, once I graduated with my bachelor's, to either step in as like a youth pastor somewhere and start working in seminary or go straight to seminary. I was running from God till God, through someone else, had just a simple conversation with me over lunch in March of that school year, when I realized that I had told God no in August, and that no still carried on all these months later. And so you can run away from God even though you're close, even though you're doing what you're supposed to do. You can be running from God. So of course the question is, why do we run from God? Why do you and I run from God? It's simple. We run from God when we doubt His goodness, wisdom, and justice. When we doubt His goodness, God, you say that's good? I don't know. Like, I know you say that I shouldn't do this, but I don't know. It sure seems kind of good. My lust or my impurity or my greed or consumerism. I don't know, God, that sure seems good. I know you say it's not good, but I don't know. I don't know if I trust that. I'm kind of doubting your goodness. Or your wisdom. God, I know you say this is the best way, God, I know you say that I should forgive, that I shouldn't be bitter, but you know what? And this person just doesn't deserve it. Those Ninevites just don't deserve it. God, I don't know you that you know best. God, I don't think you get it. Or we doubt his justice, just like Jonah did. God, this isn't just. You shouldn't be mercy with that, or you shouldn't show mercy with that person. You shouldn't put that on display in their life. They don't deserve that grace. And we doubt his justice. Why would God do that? Surely he can't be just. Surely he can't be good. Surely he can't be wise. It's when we doubt God, we start to run from him. Here's the thing. Jonah was a prophet, and he probably was really secure in that fact. Like they said, he was a nationalist. It's great work by this dude named Leslie Allen, who's actually a professor. He's 83 years old over in Fuller Seminary. Writes books on all the prophets in terms of the minor prophets, Joel, Obadiah, Jonah. Jonah was like, God, yeah, you want me to speak to the people of Israel? I love my people. I want what's best for them. Of course I want to convey your message. I want them to start living right. I want them to experience, God, what you have, the call you have on their life and what that means as a nation, as a tribe, as a group of people. God says, well, Jonah, actually, I want you to go and do that for them. I don't care about them, God. I thought as a prophet, I want to do this. This is what I thought my life was going to look like. My life looked like this. This is the plan I had. God said, well, it doesn't match up with my plan. Interesting how that can happen in our lives so much. God, I had this plan for my life, and I followed you and said yes to you in this, and now, where did that get me? That's the trap. That's the Jonah trap that you and I can fall into. And so my question for us tonight is, are you running from God? Are you running from God? You getting tired? Is it getting exhausting? Jesus is here to say that when you're ready to start running to God, he's that dad looking off in the distance, waiting for you to return, arms wide open, ready to celebrate your return. So maybe tonight, maybe now, stop running from God. Start running towards him. If you would, please, pray with me. Thank you so much for your attention. I appreciate it. It means a lot. Take a few moments and respond to the scriptures we just looked at. Respond to what God was talking to you about. Are you running from God? There's a lot of layers to that question. Maybe you're here tonight and you're Jonah 1 and 2 running from God. You're saying no to God and anything that he has for you. You're running as far away from God as possible, yet somehow you find yourself here tonight. I'm not sure what brought you in tonight. I just know God did. If you're here tonight and you want to stop running away from God, you want to start a faith relationship with Jesus, and that can start with a simple prayer, and I can help you with that because someone once helped me. Someone once helped me in a service just like this, and they gave me a prayer to make my own, and I want to give you a prayer to make your own. The cool thing is you don't even have to say it out loud. Only God has to hear it, and God can hear your thoughts. But I can help you out and give you some words. And there's nothing magical about this prayer. It's just the beginning of a journey with Jesus. But you can say this: Dear God, I recognize I've been running away from you, and I'm ready to stop. I'm ready to turn around, stop running away from you, and start running towards you. And Jesus, I understand that takes faith and trust, and so that's what I'm giving you, my faith and my trust. I'm putting my yes on the table, Jesus. I'm inviting you to come into my life because I trust you, and I want to trust you with my life. Heads bowed, eyes closed, no one looking around. If that was you tonight, if you were running from God, and tonight you're saying, I'm not anymore, would you just raise your hand and look right at me? I know it's kind of a bold ask, but I just want to pray for you. I don't even know your name, so I'm not even going to call you out in a room like this. I never would want to embarrass you, but I also want to get something in your hand, and I see your hand right now. That's awesome. If you could just keep it up, right on. And I see you in the back, 2 of you. That's awesome. If you could just keep your hands up. I'm going to pray over you, and I've got a leader that's going to get something in your hand. And it's that you're not signing up for this church, you're not committing to anything. It's literally just a resource to help you in this new faith journey. I see these hands. Anybody else? I see you right up front right here. That's awesome. Just keep your hand up. God is here. God is real, and he's moving in your life. Anyone else besides these 4? All right. Awesome. That's great. Let me pray for all these. God, I see hands, but you see hearts, and that's what matters. So I just pray that your reality would be so overwhelming in these people's lives. God, I pray that us as a community here at Vintage would be able to help them build their faith in you, that they would find the life that Jesus has for them. God, I pray that tonight would be a spiritual monument, a spiritual moment in their lives where they can recall tonight and say, that's when I stopped running away from God, and that's when I started running towards God. Thank you, Jesus, for your reality. Those of you who have your hands up, I know you're all across the room. It's awesome. I've got some leaders. I said in the beginning of the message that they're the best leaders in the world, and I absolutely mean it. They're going to get you some information. They're just going to have a quick conversation with you and explain this booklet we have made to you. And they're just going to do it out in the cafe area. And if you came with someone and you'd feel more comfortable bringing them, bring them along with you. We want you to feel comfortable. We want you to feel safe here. But they're going to take you out in the cafe area because we're about to sing some closing songs as we respond to God. So you're going to best hear them out there in the cafe. Let me pray for the rest of us. God, sometimes we just don't get it. I think we forget your goodness, we forget your wisdom, and we start saying no to you in little things, and then we start running away from you. We start taking small steps, and we just pivot in a slightly different direction than you're leading. We just end up in a bad spot. God, the danger is we can do all of that by being surrounded by spiritual activities, being surrounded in spiritual conversations, coming to services like this. God, help us to remember that the best running is always towards you.
Thanks for watching this episode of Vintage. If God spoke to you through this talk, please click on the button titled, How Do I Follow Jesus, on our website, and feel free to contact us and let us know what God is doing in your life. Thanks again for watching.